Well, look at that. We will begin shortly, and we will. Although it's taken us a long time to begin shortly. But now we are here. Joseph Pearce from South Carolina this week. Stephen and myself, Father Fessio here in San Francisco. We're continuing on this wonderful book, Rethinking Mary in the New Testament by Edward Sri. And we're taking about 6 chapters a session. We've taken 2 sessions. So we finished chapters 1 through 12. And this session, we're going to cover chapters 13 through 18. And I have most of my comments come in chapter 14 and 17 and 18. I got a few in the first part here, but let's begin with
My first is on page 124. I don't know if anybody actually trumps me on that.
124. Well, that's chapter 13, Mary and the
Yeah.
return of glory. So go ahead, 124.
Okay, and if you permit me to actually to read, it's about almost half a page, because this is all new to me, because I'm showing my ignorance here, and and I hope it's going to astonish in a very good way everyone else. So the bottom paragraph on page 124. In response to this plea, God sends the angel Gabriel to Daniel. This is talking about the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy. Says the angel Gabriel to Daniel to give him a prophecy that would give hope to the Jews for centuries to come. At the hour of the evening sacrifice, Gabriel appears to Daniel and announces that God will answer his prayer, but only after a long period of time, a period described as, quote, 70 weeks of years, which I love that poetic turn of phrase. At the end of that time, God would send an anointed one, Messiah, who would bring an end to sin, atone for iniquity, usher in everlasting righteousness, fulfill all prophecy, and anoint a most holy place. And then this actually some numerology and mathematics here from history, which I knew nothing about. While the 70 weeks of years symbolizes 490 years, since a week of years would symbolize 7 years, and 70 times 7 years equals 490 years, the central takeaway of Gabriel's message signals that it will be several centuries before God sends his anointed one to restore the Jewish people and shine his face again on the holy temple. This prophecy is important for Luke's gospel because after the book of Daniel, the next time the angel Gabriel appears in the Bible is about 5 centuries later, reminiscent of the 490 years in Luke's opening scene, the Annunciation to Zechariah. So again, for me, this was all new. I'm betraying and showing my ignorance here of biblical theology, but obviously I know as a Catholic that the Old Testament prefigures the new and the new fulfills the old, but these specific details here, when does Gabriel makes an announcement, it'll be 490 years, and it's 500 years so later when he reappears. This obviously is it blew me away.
Well, especially when you read Daniel or read excerpts from Daniel, there's so much mysterious, apocalyptic, difficult to interpret material there that suddenly this shines through like a big light going on. As you said, yes, that's right. Well, also, I was going to highlight the subheads in this chapter, and that was the second subhead for the 7 weeks of years. The first is the glory of the Lord, and once again, that is a prefigurement in the Old Testament. Where was the glory of the Lord? It was in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, between the wings of the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant, but the glory had disappeared in 586, 587, whenever it was the Babylonians came, for 70 weeks of years. So it's not only the time that is predicted, but what's going to happen. The return of the glory of the Lord to the temple. No, it's phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. And again, there's a bottom of page 127, the visual image here. He's got a little diagram, from to connect that 490 years to 490 days. So from the Annunciation to Zechariah, the Annunciation to Mary is 6 months, or 180 days. And then from the Annunciation to Mary to the birth of Jesus is 9 months, 270 days. And the birth of Jesus to presentation is another 40 days. And you add all those up together, it's 490 days. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff for me.
And I think it's true that because Luke does give those temporal milestones, that the interpretation here is not far-fetched. However, Joseph, as a Shakespearean scholar, you'll be aware of people who find anagrams and special dates and everything else in Shakespeare that are really eisegesis, reading it in, as opposed to exegesis. But I don't compare that with this because I do think, as you say, this really has the basis in the text. Why does Luke tell us 5 months, 3 months, so many days? You know.
But I take your point, Father, which is why I made a point in the opening chapter to make that difference between exegesis and eisegesis.
Yes. Let us see here. Vivian, would you like to comment? You don't have to.
I think you got to the heart of that chapter, so maybe we should just move on. By the way, these chapters, these are still about the presentation and taking it kind of in pieces. So the next chapter, 14, pierced by a sword, comes from Simeon's prophecy to Mary that her son's destiny was going to result in her being pierced by a sword. But he takes each one of these statements from Simeon and elaborates a little bit on them. And I guess well aware of Jesus's physical suffering on the cross, right? And so when you hear this expression, pierced by a sword, you think first and foremost of the image of the Christ dying on the cross and, of course, being pierced by a sword while on the cross and so on. But he also mentions, the opposition to Christ being a source of suffering for his mother, the rejection of her son also being a source of suffering. I hadn't really meditated on that as much, what that would do to a mother for her son to be, well, the killing of him was simply the, bringing to bear the rejection in the most violent and awful way possible.
And he makes that connection between Christ pierced by a sword, which literally happened, and Mary's heart being pierced, but going back to Psalm 22, which is one of the primary psalms of the suffering of the Lord. There's 3 or 4 psalms which really prefigure an almost specific and exact language the suffering of Jesus. But here in Psalm 22, the suffering servant there, the suffering man says, deliver my soul. This is on page 133 at the bottom. Deliver my soul, psyche, soul, from the sword, rhomphias, okay? And those 2 Greek words for soul and sword are exactly the same words that Simeon uses talking to Our Lady. And then on page 134, Edward Sri says, with these verbal and thematic similarities between Psalm 22 and Luke 2, Luke links Mary with his narrative of Jesus' resurrection and passion, a narrative that alludes to Psalm 22. And so this beautiful connection between Mary and the passion, by connecting her to the man who's suffering in Psalm 22, which is a prefiguration of Jesus, that really is, that's beautiful.
And then Pope John Paul II sort of calling this prophecy of Simeon a second Annunciation. That when Mary agrees to be the Son of the Lord in the Annunciation, this is obviously going to be an unfolding reality. Well, now it just got opened up even more poignantly, and her obedience.
Yeah, just below that quote from St. John Paul II, right at the bottom of the page there, 134, again, this analogy, her fiat in Galilee, where she first accepted the life of the Christ child in her womb, will ultimately lead her to Calvary, where she will sorrowfully witness him offer his life on the cross. And I think that those people that listen to that watch the book club week in, week out, have heard me say this before. It's a key motif in my thinking. But the quote from the Morris Baring novel, that where the priest character says that the acceptance of sorrow is the meaning of life. When you understand that, you would understand everything. And it's not sorrow, but the acceptance of sorrow. And so the key word here, her fiat in Galilee, where she first accepted the life of the Christ child, will lead to Calvary and the acceptance of the suffering there.
On 135, he also says the only person, middle of the page, in Luke's gospel whose soul is mentioned and described is Mary's. Luke mentions Mary's soul not just once, but twice. And of course, that's the key word in the Magnificat, "E psuche mea," my soul magnifies the Lord. There's an interplay here between historical events and the recounting of events in literary text. And, there's two extremes. One is to say, well, they simply recorded what took place and they're replaying the recording to us. The other extreme is, well, it didn't take place at all, but it's being created literarily by the author. No, there's an interplay between the real facts of Jesus' life and Mary's life and the literary presentation of that, in which it's a whole. You can't always break it apart and say, well, what were the ipsissima verba? What exactly did Mary really say? Well, if you go at it historically only, you run in a quandary. But on the other hand, if it's the same Spirit who's guiding Jesus, the Word of God, and guiding Luke, who is reflecting that word in his literary presentation, guided by the Spirit, well, then we know we've got the picture of Jesus that God wanted us to have.
Right.
It's an incarnate picture. It's the divine Son made flesh, who lived historically, and these acts are true acts, but it's also how they're received by Mary and by us and then presented in Scripture. So it's a beautiful thing. We're never going to be able to disentangle it completely until heaven,
Right.
And that's the same God who's acting all this while through history, which is why these events can foreshadow other events or be fulfilled by other events.
Exactly. On to chapter 15, finding her son in the temple. We're still in Luke's gospel now. I only had one comment on that.
Well,
actually, it's not in that chapter, is it? 145.
I've got 138 next, the second page of that chapter.
Go ahead.
Well, I have 137 because
you go first.
Something that totally popped out at me on page 137, that the Torah did not require women to go on pilgrimage for the Passover.
Oh, yeah.
So this underlines even more the devotedness of the Holy Family, that a whole family would make this pilgrimage. It wasn't a legal requirement. It was something they did out of love for God. That already put this event into a different category for me.
Absolutely. Well, very similar experience for me. Sort of something that leapt out at me as something new was immediately after that, top of the next page, 138. Yesterday I was digging out the duck pond, and Evangeline was up on the hill. She wanted to go for a walk in the woods, and we said she couldn't because I wasn't available to go with her. And then Susanna said, "Where's Evangeline?" Right? And we didn't know, right? And immediately you begin to panic. And I said to Susanna, "Well, before we start hunting through the woods for her, check she hasn't gone indoors, right? Because she wouldn't bother to tell us she got indoors." And of course she had. So we were greatly relieved. But so it seemed to me here, this story, I've always puzzled as a parent, well, how on earth did Mary and Joseph have no idea that their 13-year-old kid, I mean, Evangeline's 12 on Saturday, right? So the similarity here, disappear for days on end, right? And we don't have this concept, first of all, the extended family, and then the extended family within a broader extended family. So this description on page 138, that such a caravan of families would have been chaotic, with people traveling at different paces, some faster than others. But at the end of each day, the whole group would meet together to rest for the night. The 12-year-old Jesus was free to spend time with other friends and relatives his age. In other words, they wouldn't be surprised he's wandering with other relatives, and it's not till the end of the day they'd even get concerned. Again, I hadn't really visualized this scenario. I'm the parent of a nuclear family with just just keep an eye on your kid, micromanage every second. And of course, this wasn't what happened in this scenario. And seeing that historical context really brought the whole finding of our Lord in the temple home to me in a whole new light.
I think, as Americans, North Americans, we're used to having like the nuclear family, if we have a family at all. But I mean, you're in your house, like here on our block, I don't know anybody except for our neighbors right next to us. I don't know who they are, these neighbors, But you think in Nazareth, a small village, they're going to make on this pilgrimage. It's a huge communal event. Everybody knows each other, walking down the road together. And I've seen that in Mexico. You go down a little village in Mexico, and there's kids all over the place. You don't know who they belong to, but
Yep.
they're all taking care of each other,
Yeah.
Yeah, those poor Mexicans, they're not forward looking like we Americans, every mañana, they relax, take their time. People count, that's all.
Right. Manana, there's a lot of wisdom in manana. That's what I say.
There is. All
Well,
right.
I have to put in a good word here. The neighborhood we all lived in before we moved here
well, yeah.
was a very close-knit neighborhood. But there are times when even strangers can become your friends and neighbors. So when we lost our daughter in Costco, of all places, and it's very scary in a city like San Francisco to lose any child anywhere, okay? I don't need to elaborate. And there we were calling, my husband and I, calling her name, calling her name. Next thing you know, all these other people around us didn't know who we were. They're calling, Mary, Mary. There must have been 20 different people who took up the call to go searching for our child. It was really heartwarming. And it turned out she had fallen asleep on a Costco couch, decided to take a nap. A Costco employee found her there, didn't know who she belonged to, so that person just picked her up and took her to the front of the store because they were going to make an announcement, with the parents of this person. But in the meanwhile, there must have been 20 people all searching for her. It was very touching. It gave me a lot of comfort that this was going to turn out okay. And
it's the silent minority we don't hear about in the media or amongst the celebrities.
Yeah,
it's true.
People.
Yeah. There's a lot of goodness in people's hearts. They just need an opportunity to show it.
There is. On to chapter 16, Mary at Cana. Now we're going into John's Gospel. We finished Luke's Gospel. But it's amazing to me and wonderful how Edward Sri has taken a very, really small literary content here in terms of verses and showed the connection with the Old Testament, with, the Psalms and everything, and the Greek, and interweaving the rest of the Gospel. I mean, it really does illuminate and enrich your understanding of what looks like a pretty minimal text.
Yes, I agree. This was a really educational chapter for me, too.
So chapter 16, Mary at Cana, we're now in John's Gospel, his first sign, the wedding at Cana, very first paragraph there. He says, she, that is Mary, only appears in two scenes, the wedding at Cana and the crucifixion. And that is not, by chance. There's an important thing which we'll see in this chapter and more in the book. The crucifixion is a nuptial event. That is when Christ, the bridegroom, gives himself to his bride, pours out his whole being, body and blood. Blood and water come out of his side. And that's been lost. It was very important in the Middle Ages. I mean, the most commented book of the whole Bible, Old New Testament, for more than 300 years, Middle Ages, was the Song of Songs. The bridegroom-bride relationship. And we lost that, and especially in America, we're so confused about sexuality. We can't tell a man from a woman anymore. As a friend of mine used to say about San Francisco, you have to tear and compare when you see two people going together.
It's terrible. Terrible, get it?
But anyway, we need to, and this will help us, we need to remind ourselves continually of the way God created us, male and female, and why. It's because God the Father sent his Son to be the bridegroom of his church, the bride, to have a union which is more one than the nuptial union. We become one flesh. And so here in John's Gospel, why is it that Mary appears at Cana and the crucifixion? Well, we're talking about a wedding feast here. Okay, that's my homily for this chapter.
Well, that's beautiful, Father. And when he actually brings in the author, that is, that when Jesus does respond to the need for wine and produces the miracle, he is acting as a bridegroom by doing that it's the bridegroom's responsibility to provide the wine. That, that just brought that even more to the fore, that Jesus...
I agree. I mean, that same thing with me. And I've got that flag. That's towards the end of the chapter, I think. I've got something a bit earlier than that, if you don't mind. It's just, page 148. There's this sort of biblical theologians, perhaps of the Protestant stripe. The fact that Mary's first words are, "They have no wine," and then they sort of say this is a minimalist interpretation of this. It would have been impossible for Mary to perceive the supernatural at work in Jesus just by merely uttering those words. And then you have this sentence, middle of page 148, which I think is so understated, it's almost funny. As the authors of the ecumenical work Mary in the New Testament explain, if other people in John's Gospel recognize something supernatural in Jesus, even before the first public display of his divine power, so could Mary. Right? Now you think about this. I mean, even the assumption that she had never experienced his supernatural power before, we don't know, right? He's now 30 years old, and she might just say this, do what he says, because she knows, maybe from experience. We don't know what happened in the family home. It's a perfect example of, that the letter is being the only truth. No, it's obviously all that we have to go on, but it's not all that happened, right? So it's making this distinction, right?
Yes.
All right. I'm happy to go on to the next chapter 17 because I've got several comments I want to make there, starting on page 154. Does someone have something before that?
No, I'm 155.
This is a very prosaic comment, a third of the way from the bottom, because Jesus changes the water into wine. How much water? 120 gallons of wine for the party. Okay, well, I happen to have a little vineyard, and I have 1,437 vines, which is the date of birth of St. Catherine of Siena, 1437. And it's fruitful, and I produce about 80 cases a year. Well, 120 gallons is actually 48 cases of wine. So I actually produce a little more than Jesus did, but he did it instantaneously. It takes me all year to do that.
And you feel a little bit sort of peeved, Father, that you have to work for a whole year, and Jesus just performs a miracle just like that.
No, I'm happy because he understands it. It takes me a year to understand what's happening. He understood immediately. But the fact that the water comes into the ground and the little grapes, they bud and then they blossom and you train the shoots and then you prune them, before that, and then you have to spray them. All that process, it's a beautiful process to see how God the Father turns water into wine every year. This is from C.S. Lewis, by his book Miracles, where Jesus the Son, who does what he sees his Father doing, says, "Oh, Father, let me do that now for you." Boom, instantaneously. So I'm not disappointed at all.
Good, I'm pleased.
I'll bet his wine was better than mine.
Does that disappoint you, Father?
No, but I try and approach that anyway. He says, "Be holy as my Father is holy." Well, make wine as my Father makes wine.
Well, what strikes you about knowing that this is 120 gallons is the utter extravagance of it.
Yes.
The surfeit that God doesn't just give what we need; He gives us even beyond that. And when the author focuses on the fact that the gospel mentions the stone jars were filled to the brim. Now, if you take a pitcher or a ladle or something into that to get the wine out, what's going to happen? It's literally going to spill over the sides because of displacement, right? So Jesus not only produced this extravagant amount, but he knew there would be waste when they went to go take it out. That should just, the gratuitousness of God and his generosity.
We can go off on a very brief tangent on that. The use of the word extravagance there, or extravagant. We don't have a TV in our house, but we do occasionally watch a video together. So last night we watched Man vs. Wild, which you may not have heard of, but it's Bear Grylls, who's a former SAS Special Forces British person, and they basically stick him in the middle of nowhere, and he has to show how to survive when you're by yourself. So he's in the middle of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador, right? And he hasn't managed to light a fire because everything's wet. He says, the first time I've never been able to light a fire in my life. So he just basically huddles down and gets soaking wet all day. And next morning, he says, you know what cheers me up? He said, and he looked up, he said, there's a flower up there that no one's ever seen before. And that's God's extravagance. God's extravagance, right? So just the perception of beauty is enough, right, to actually rekindle our spirits and uplift us, edify us.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. On page 156, there's an objection here. Gaventa, who's the author he's quoting here, who has an objection, pointedly asks this good question. If we were to think that its use in chapter 2, verse 4, makes Jesus' mother a symbolic figure, then why not draw the same conclusion concerning Jesus' address to the Samaritan woman and to Mary Magdalene? Are they also symbols of Eve or of the church? Well, the answer that he's expecting is no. But my answer is yes, that every woman in the New Testament is a real woman, but also a symbol of woman. You know, Eve, Mary, church. And so I don't take this objection to, Suri has to try and say, well, Mary's special, and therefore she's really the symbol of Eve in the church. That's true. But every woman is woman, and therefore symbolizes what woman is meant to be.
Yeah, and again on the next page, Father, I mean, in the extraordinary form of the Mass, the second Gospel is always obviously it's the first chapter of St. John's Gospel, and that was my favorite. It's my favorite part of the whole of Scripture. Long before I even knew that, that was another little bubbling bonus. But but again, Edward Sri here shows us, and of course it's obvious, but nonetheless astonishing, that St. John's Gospel opens deliberately analogously to the opening of Genesis. So this is the new creation, and so the whole of St. John's Gospel needs to be read, including the miracle at Cana, needs to be read within that understanding.
Yes. I'm going to jump to page 163 unless someone's got something in between.
Oh, well, just to shore up what I was saying before about the extravagance and the abundance, the author points out on page 161 that an abundance of wine was associated with the arrival of the Messiah in the prophetic texts of the Old Testament. That I didn't know. I didn't know that there was supposed to be some connection symbolically. So that was something I learned.
And then following on that, page 163, towards the bottom there, this sheds much light on the meaning of what is this to you and to me? It's as if Jesus is saying, for me and for you, the wine has different meanings. And that, I never thought about that before, but wine is symbolic, but there is this wedding feast where there's real little wine that's run out, and Mary wants to do something about it. And Jesus is seeing the wine as a symbol, of the coming of Messiah, the abundance that the Messiah brings. So in a certain sense, that expression, which is an odd expression in English, what is this to me and to you, woman, takes on a deeper meaning that I think Ed Sri really brings out. It's really good.
I heard a homily at a wedding mass a little while ago where the priest used the wedding of Cana, the wine that runs out, and now the wine that Jesus supplies, as an analogy for what a married couple is going to need in the course of their married life, that their own natural wine is going to eventually run out, and they're going to need Jesus now to supply what is needed. I thought that was a beautiful way to use this miracle. But then when Ed Shree talked about the two different meanings of the wine, from Mary's point of view, just a material need that these people lack, and Jesus seeing this on another level, kind of went hand in hand with that sermon.
Well, that wasn't my homily.
No, it wasn't.
But I will say, whenever the couple chooses the wedding feast at Cana for the gospel, I always say that very thing.
You do?
Yeah,
Okay.
This great enthusiasm you have now, this first love, that's going to run out.
Yes.
Final chapter of today's session, 18. Do whatever he tells you. Anybody have any comments on that? I have something on page 168 I want to mention.
Go for it.
Joseph?
Well, the only thing I have on 168 is obviously Jesus, the true bridegroom, and the symbolism of that. But I'm going to let you wax eloquent.
Well, no, I was actually going to speak of something prior to that in the previous subheading called trust. Just this interesting thing that those at the wedding feast who are in the service of the bridegroom are not called servants in the sense of slaves, douloi, because that word doulos, slave, comes up a lot, being a slave of Christ. Rather, John calls them diakonos, the Greek word from which we get deacon in English. In John's gospel, this word is used to describe not a household servant, but someone who is a servant of the Lord in the sense of being a faithful disciple. For example, in John 12:26, Jesus says, if anyone serves me, diakone, he must follow me, and where I am, there shall my servant, diakonos, be also. Now, it's interesting that the distinction between douloi, servants, slaves, and diakonoi, ministers or servants. And here at the wedding feast of Cana, if you are helping at the wedding feast, you're not a doulos, a slave, you're a diakonos, you're a minister. That was pretty good.
And on page 168, the true bridegroom, just to dovetail with you, Father, you quoted from C.S. Lewis earlier from Miracles, but I remember a wonderful thing. I think it was in Lewis's essay, Priestesses in the Church.
Oh, yes.
Where he talks about the priest at the altar being in persona Christi and therefore as the bridegroom. And insofar as the Christ is the bridegroom, all of us, male or female, in the congregation as members of the church are the bride of Christ, and therefore we're all in some mystical sense feminine in relation to the masculinity of Christ at the altar as the true bridegroom.
Amen. On page 170, and you mentioned this, I think, earlier, Vivian, but this is where it comes in the book. At the end of the subsection there, middle of the page, John attributes the conservation of the chalice wine to Jesus, who at the level of symbolic takes upon himself the role of the groom. He is the real groom who has conserved the choice wine up till now, which is for John the beginning of the signs, the beginning of salvation. So normally, as you said, it's the bridegroom who takes care of the wine. Here, Jesus is going to take over the role of the bridegroom.
And then you can't help but think of Jesus's statement that comes later on. I don't know which gospel, about not being able to put new wine in old wineskins. You know, he's produced this new wine, and it turns out that that's what we're supposed to be part of, partaking of. But in order to do it, we'd have to make some changes. Can't use the same old, same old.
And then my final comment on this chapter is on page 171, the last page of the chapter, where Ed Shree makes the connection between the response at Sinai of the people to the covenant and what Mary says here. So in the covenant, the first Mosaic covenant, we read, quote, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, unquote. That's like the yes of the union of two contracting parties. So that's the bridal movement of the God with his people, you know. What's significant for our purpose is that Mary echoes those very words in the context of a wedding feast at Cana, in a scene that focuses on a wedding, has the Sinai covenant in the background, draws on hopes for the bridegroom Messiah, and portrays Jesus in the role of the bridegroom, but never mentions the bride. In such a scene as this, Mary has on her lips these words echoing what the bride Israel spoke to her bridegroom at Sinai long ago. Because we know from the Gospels that Jesus is the bridegroom. Because when they asked Jesus, well, John's disciples fast, yours don't, why not? He says, well, how can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is there? Well, that's saying I'm the bridegroom, right? But in the whole New Testament, the bride is never mentioned. Well, except in Paul, Ephesians, where the bride becomes the church. But in the Gospels, Jesus never mentions the bride. But here it's clear that Mary is the bride, and through Mary, all of us, as feminine with respect to God, are the bride.
Right. And because on page 170 at the bottom, he says, Mary thus stands as a representative of God's people, a model of faith, speaking the words of covenant faithfulness. The words, by the way, when she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you, he's saying those are the words that echo whatever the Lord says we will do. But again, this idea that Mary is representative of the rest of us. So if she's the bride, we all are the bride.
Yeah, I mean, I'm agreeing with this. This is a both and, not an either or. I don't want to end the episode with controversy, but I do think that the other aspect here, which is important, is not merely Mary as bride, but Mary as mother. In other words, she's mater ecclesiae. She's the mother of the bride in the sense that she's the mother of the church. And I think that's another aspect that we need to not lose sight of, because she is one of us, but she's not just one of us.
Well, it goes back to his chapter on the Queen Mother,
yes.
being able to give these sorts of requests and commands even to the king. So this is exactly what she's doing in this miracle.
Of God, she's also in some ways mother of the bridegroom.
Right.
And, yeah, so there we are.
Right.
All right, so we're going to finish this book next week. We hope to have a following week with the author Ed Sri, kind of a wrap up, and we can ask some questions. And then what comes after that, Joseph?
Well, we've got obviously the Ignatius Press have published an exciting new book, co-authored by Pope Emeritus Benedict, whom we all greatly revere, of course, and Cardinal Sarah, who we also revere, especially after having read his book recently. So we're going to be turning to Cardinal Sarah this time as a co-author with Pope Emeritus Benedict for our next book. And that title of that book is
From the Depths of Our Hearts.
There we are.
All right. Well, we will see you all next week. God bless you. Thanks for listening.